The Alabama sun beat mercilessly against the white columns of Crow Manor, casting long shadows across the sprawling cotton fields that stretched beyond the horizon. In the summer of 1852, the plantation had become a place where whispers died before they could take flight, and even the cicadas seemed to hush their songs when Master Nathaniel Crow emerged from his study. It had been 3 months since Evangeline Crow's funeral, yet her husband still wore the same black suit he'd donned for her burial. The fabric clung to his gaunt frame, stained with sweat and something darker that the house slaves dared not question. His once pristine appearance had deteriorated into something that made even the overseer, Thomas Whitmore, uncomfortable during their increasingly rare meetings. "Master Crow," Whitmore ventured one sweltering afternoon, removing his hat as he stood in the manor's grand foyer. "The cotton needs harvesting soon, and the hands are asking about—" "The hands ask too many questions," Crow interrupted, his voice hollow as an empty well, his bloodshot eyes fixed on a portrait of Evangeline that dominated the wall above the marble fireplace. "Tell them to tend to their work, and nothing more." Whitmore shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. "Sir, with respect, some of the field hands are saying strange things about sounds coming from the manor at night. The women especially seem troubled." Crow's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Troubled? They should be grateful for the roof over their heads and the food in their bellies." His fingers drummed against the mahogany banister, each tap echoing through the silent house. "Speaking of the women, send Etta to my study tonight, and Ruth. I have spiritual matters to discuss with them." The overseer's stomach churned, but he nodded curtly. "Yes, sir. Anything else?" "Privacy, Whitmore. I require absolute privacy for my evening prayers. See that no one disturbs the manor after sunset." As Whitmore departed, Crow ascended the curved staircase to his study, where medical texts lay open beside theological volumes and his late wife's personal effects. The room reeked of laudanum and unwashed flesh, a combination that had become his constant companion since Evangeline's passing. He paused before her vanity mirror, still adorned with her silver hairbrush and pearl necklaces. In the reflection, he could swear he saw her pale face watching him, her lips moving in silent accusation. The visions had begun shortly after the funeral, growing more vivid with each passing night. "Forgive me, my darling," he whispered to the mirror. "But I must find a way to cleanse this sin from my soul. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and perhaps through suffering comes redemption." Down in the slave quarters, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Etta, a woman of 35, whose dark skin bore the intricate scars of her West African heritage, sat grinding herbs by the light of a small fire. Her weathered hands worked methodically, crushing roots and leaves that her grandmother had taught her to use for protection. "You feel it too, don't you?" Ruth whispered, settling beside her friend. At 22, Ruth still carried herself with a dignity that years of bondage hadn't broken, though recent weeks had carved new lines of worry around her eyes. Etta nodded slowly. Something's changed in that house. Something dark. She glanced toward the manor, where a single light flickered in the master's study window. My grandmother used to tell stories about men who lose their way after death touches their lives. They become hungry for things that ain't natural. What kind of things? Ruth's voice was barely audible. Before Etta could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps made both women freeze. Whitmore emerged from the darkness, his face grim in the firelight. Etta. Ruth. Master wants to see you in his study. Now. The two women exchanged glances, and Etta quickly tucked the small pouch of herbs into her dress. As they walked toward the manor, she whispered a prayer in her native tongue. Not to the Christian God that had been forced upon them, but to the ancestors who still watched over their children from across the ocean. The manor's interior felt different at night, as if the very walls had absorbed years of suffering and were now exhaling it back into the air. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames, and the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with an ominous rhythm that matched their racing heartbeats. Crow's study door stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of amber light within. As they approached, both women could hear him speaking in low, urgent tones, though no other voice responded. "Enter," he commanded before they could knock. The study had been transformed since either woman had last cleaned it. Religious texts lay scattered across every surface, their pages marked with frantic annotations in red ink. Candles burned in unusual arrangements, forming patterns that neither woman recognized, but that made Etta's skin crawl with ancestral memory. Crow stood with his back to them, facing the large window that overlooked the cotton fields. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had aged decades in mere months, his once proud bearing now hunched with an invisible weight. "Do you know why I've called you here?" he asked without turning around. "No, Master," Ruth replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I am a man in need of salvation," Crow continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. "My dear Evangeline, she speaks to me now. She tells me of the sins that blacken my soul, of the corruption that festers within me like a cancer." He turned slowly, and both women had to suppress gasps at his appearance. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and his eyes held a fervor that bordered on madness. "She says that only through the suffering of others can I find redemption, that God tests us through trials of flesh and spirit." His gaze fixed on Etta, then Ruth, with an intensity that made them both step backward. "You will help me find that redemption." Etta's hand instinctively moved to the herb pouch hidden in her dress. "Master, we're just here to serve. Whatever you need." "What I need," Crow interrupted, moving closer, "is to understand the nature of sin itself, to explore the depths of human depravity so that I might climb back toward the light." His smile was cold and predatory. "And you, my dear children, will be my guides on this journey." The clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its deep tones reverberating through the manor like a death knell. In that moment, both women understood that their lives had just taken a turn toward a darkness they could never have imagined. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and the first drops of rain began to fall on the cotton fields, as if the very sky were weeping for what was to come. The rain that had begun as gentle drops the night before had transformed into a relentless downpour by morning, turning the plantation's dirt roads into rivers of red mud. The field hands worked in miserable conditions, their clothes soaked through as they tended to the cotton that would soon be ready for harvest. But their physical discomfort paled in comparison to the psychological torment that had settled over the slave quarters like a suffocating blanket. Etta and Ruth had returned to their cabin near dawn, their clothes disheveled and their eyes hollow with a trauma they couldn't yet speak aloud. They sat in silence as the other women prepared for the day's work, the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. Dinah, a 17-year-old girl whose beauty had already caught unwanted attention from various white men on neighboring plantations, noticed the change immediately. "What happened up there?" she whispered, kneeling beside Etta's pallet. Etta's hands trembled as she tried to braid her hair, the simple task suddenly requiring enormous concentration. "Don't ask questions you don't want answered, child." But Mercy, a woman of 25 whose quick wit had made her valuable as a house servant, wasn't so easily deterred. She had seen too much in her years of service to ignore the signs. "He hurt you, didn't he? Both of you?" Ruth finally spoke, her voice cracked and raw. It wasn't like anything I've ever... He made us..." She couldn't finish the sentence, her body shaking with remembered horror. Etta reached for her friend's hand, squeezing it tightly. "He's lost his mind, completely lost it. He kept talking about his dead wife, about cleansing his soul through things no Christian man should even think about." The four women huddled together as the rain drummed against their cabin's thin walls. Outside, they could hear the overseer shouting orders to the field hands, but his voice seemed to come from another world, a world where normal rules still applied. "What did he make you do?" Dinah asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. Etta closed her eyes, trying to block out the memories of the previous night. Crow had forced them to participate in what he called a purification ritual, claiming that his wife's spirit demanded it. The details were too horrific to share, involving degradation and violence that he justified through twisted interpretations of biblical passages. "He's planning to call for more of us," Ruth said quietly. "He told us we were just the beginning, that his wife's spirit requires a complete cleansing." Mercy felt ice form in her stomach. "Who else?" "All of us," Etta replied. "He specifically mentioned you and Dinah by name." The young girl's face went pale. "I won't go. I'll run first." "And go where?" Mercy asked bitterly. "You know what they do to runaways. At least if we stay, we might find a way to..." "To what?" Ruth interrupted. "To survive this. You didn't see his eyes last night. There's nothing human left in them." Etta stood slowly, her body aching from the previous night's ordeal. She moved to a loose floorboard in the corner of the cabin and carefully pried it up, revealing a small collection of items hidden beneath. Dried herbs, carved bones, and a small wooden figure wrapped in red cloth. "My grandmother gave me these before she died," she said, unwrapping the figure to reveal an intricately carved representation of a woman with outstretched arms. "She said they were for protection against evil spirits. I never thought I'd need them here." Dinah stared at the objects with wide eyes. That's witchcraft. If they catch you with those, what they'll do to us for practicing the old ways is nothing compared to what that madman has planned," Etta replied firmly. "My grandmother survived the crossing from Africa. She survived the auction block. She survived 30 years of bondage. And she taught me that sometimes, when the white man's God fails you, you have to turn to older powers." Mercy moved closer, studying the carved figure. What can it do? Protection, maybe. Guidance. But mostly... Etta paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. Revenge. Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them all freeze. Etta quickly rewrapped the figure and shoved it back under the floorboard, just as the cabin door burst open. Whitmore stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat brim. His face was grim, and he avoided making eye contact with any of the women. "Dinah, Mercy, Master wants to see you in his study tonight after supper." The two women exchanged terrified glances, but they knew better than to protest. Whitmore's discomfort was obvious. Even he seemed to understand that something unnatural was happening in the manor. "Yes, sir," Mercy replied, her voice steady despite her fear. After Whitmore left, the four women sat in stunned silence. The rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled like the voice of an angry god. "We have to do something," Dinah said, tears streaming down her face. "We can't just let this happen." Etta nodded slowly. "Tonight, while he's busy with you two, Ruth and I will prepare. The old ways require time and proper ritual, but if we can gather enough power, if we can call on the right spirits..." "You're talking about killing him," Mercy said bluntly. "I'm talking about justice," Etta corrected. "There's a difference." As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the slave quarters grew increasingly tense. Word had spread about what was happening in the manor, though the details remained whispered secrets. The field hands worked with nervous energy, glancing frequently toward the big house where their master's madness was growing stronger with each passing hour. In his study, Crow paced before the window, his movements erratic and agitated. The rain had turned the world outside into a gray blur, but he wasn't looking at the landscape. Instead, he was focused on his reflection in the glass, where he could see Evangeline's face superimposed over his own. "Yes, my darling," he whispered to the apparition, "I understand. The cleansing must be complete. Each one must suffer as you suffered, must be broken as you were broken. Only then will my soul be pure enough to join you in paradise." The reflection seemed to smile. and Crow felt a surge of religious ecstasy. He had found his purpose, his path to redemption. The slaves were not just property, they were instruments of his salvation, vessels through which he could achieve the spiritual purification that his wife's spirit demanded. As evening approached and the rain finally began to subside, the manor took on an ominous stillness. Oil lamps flickered to life in the windows, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. In the slave quarters, 4 women prepared for a night that would change everything, though none of them yet understood just how far into darkness they would all descend before dawn broke over the cotton fields once again. The stage was set for a confrontation between madness and desperation, between the twisted faith of a broken man and the ancient power of those who refused to die quietly. And somewhere in the space between the living and the dead, Evangeline Crow's spirit watched it all unfold with eyes that burned like cold fire. The grandfather clock in Crow Manor chimed 9 times as Dinah and Mercy made their way through the servants' entrance, their bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. The manor felt different tonight. The very air seemed thick with malevolence, and the shadows cast by the oil lamps appeared to writhe and dance with unnatural life. Mercy had worked in the big house for years, but she had never felt the oppressive weight that now pressed down on her shoulders. Every portrait on the walls seemed to watch their progress, and the familiar creaking of the old building sounded like whispered warnings in a language she couldn't understand. "Stay close to me," she whispered to Dinah, whose youth made her even more vulnerable to whatever horrors awaited them. "Whatever happens, don't fight him directly. It'll only make things worse." Dinah nodded, though her entire body trembled with fear. She had heard the stories from other plantations, tales of masters who had lost their minds and the terrible things they did to their human property. But those had always seemed like distant nightmares, not something that could happen here. The study door stood open, revealing Crow silhouetted against the window. He had changed since the previous night, his appearance becoming even more haggard and wild. His hair hung in greasy strands around his face, and his clothes were stained with substances that neither woman wanted to identify. "Enter, my children," he said without turning around, his voice carrying an unsettling mixture of religious fervor and barely contained madness. "The Lord has blessed us with another opportunity for purification." The room had been further transformed since Etta and Ruth's visit. More candles burned in strange patterns, their wax pooling on the floor in designs that hurt to look at directly. Religious texts lay open alongside what appeared to be medical journals, their pages filled with diagrams and annotations that made Mercy's stomach turn. But it was the addition of new items that truly terrified them. Lengths of rope, metal implements that gleamed in the candlelight, and a collection of bottles containing liquids of various colors. On his desk sat a leather-bound journal, its pages covered with frantic handwriting in what looked like dried blood. "Do you know why you're here?" Crow asked, finally turning to face them. His eyes held a fervor that bordered on ecstasy, and his smile was the expression of a man who had found purpose in the depths of depravity. "No, Master," Mercy replied, though she suspected she knew all too well. "My dear Evangeline has been speaking to me more clearly each night," he continued, moving closer to them with predatory grace. "She has shown me the path to redemption, the way to cleanse the sin from my soul. But it requires sacrifice. It requires suffering." He gestured to the implements on his desk. "These tools will help us explore the boundaries between pleasure and pain, between the sacred and the profane. Through your suffering, I will find my salvation." Dinah couldn't suppress a whimper of fear, and Crow's attention immediately focused on her. "Ah, the young one. Evangeline tells me that innocence is the most precious offering of all, that through the corruption of purity, we can achieve the greatest spiritual heights." Meanwhile, in their cabin, Etta and Ruth worked by the light of a single candle, preparing for what they knew might be their only chance to stop the madness consuming their master. Etta had arranged her grandmother's artifacts in a careful pattern on the floor, while Ruth kept watch at the window. "Are you sure this will work?" Ruth whispered, her eyes fixed on the manor where they could see lights flickering in the study windows. "I'm not sure of anything," Etta admitted, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle that had belonged to her ancestors. "But my grandmother always said that the spirits of the dead can be called upon for justice. And if ever there was a time for justice..." She mixed the ground herbs with water from a stream that ran through the plantation, creating a dark paste that she began to spread on her arms and face in intricate patterns. The designs were ones her grandmother had taught her in secret, symbols of protection and power that predated the arrival of white men on African shores. "What about the others?" Ruth asked. "Dinah and Mercy." "They'll have to survive until we can complete the ritual," Etta replied grimly. "The spirits require time to gather their strength, but once they do..." She paused, her eyes reflecting the candle flame. "Once they do, Nathaniel Crow will learn that some sins cannot be forgiven." Back in the study, Crow had begun what he called his spiritual examination of Dinah and Mercy. The details were too horrific for either woman to process fully. Their minds retreated into protective numbness as he subjected them to degradations that he justified through twisted interpretations of religious doctrine. "You see," he explained as he worked, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon, "the flesh must be mortified before the spirit can be purified." St. Augustine himself wrote of the necessity of suffering in the pursuit of divine grace. Mercy tried to focus on anything other than what was happening to her body. She fixed her gaze on the portrait of Evangeline Crow that dominated one wall, and for a moment she could have sworn she saw the painted woman's lips move in silent apology. But it was Dinah's screams that finally broke through her protective detachment. The young girl's cries of pain and terror filled the study, echoing off the walls and seeming to give Crow even greater pleasure in his work. "Yes," he whispered, his eyes rolling back in religious ecstasy. "Yes, I can feel it. The sin leaving my soul, the corruption being burned away by your suffering. Evangeline, my darling, can you see how I'm purifying myself for you?" In the slave quarters, Etta felt a chill run down her spine as Dinah's screams reached her ears. The sound seemed to energize the artifacts around her, and she could swear she felt the presence of her ancestors gathering in the small cabin. "It's time," she whispered to Ruth. "Help me with the final preparations." The two women worked quickly, creating a circle of salt and herbs around the carved figure that represented their ancestral protector. Etta began to chant in her native tongue, words that her grandmother had taught her, but that she had never fully understood until this moment. As her voice rose and fell in the ancient rhythm, the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. The candle flame flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows that appeared to take on human form. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the circle, Ruth could swear she heard the whispered voices of the dead. The ritual was beginning, and with it, the first stirrings of a vengeance that had been building for generations. The spirits of those who had died in bondage were awakening, drawn by the call of their descendant and the promise of justice for crimes that had gone unpunished for too long. In the manor, Crow continued his twisted ceremony, unaware that forces beyond his comprehension were gathering against him. The night was still young, and before dawn broke over the cotton fields, the plantation would be forever changed by the collision of madness and ancient power. The screams from the study grew louder, and in response, the chanting from the slave quarters grew stronger. Two rituals were taking place simultaneously, one born of insanity and corruption, the other of desperation and righteous anger. Only one would survive until morning. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke just after midnight, unleashing torrents of rain that turned the plantation grounds into a muddy quagmire. Lightning split the sky with violent intensity, illuminating the manor in stark, ghostly flashes that made it appear to flicker in and out of existence. In his study, Crow had reached new depths of depravity with Dinah and Mercy. The young women lay broken and barely conscious on the floor, their bodies bearing the evidence of his twisted purification ritual. But rather than satisfaction, Crow felt only an insatiable hunger for more suffering, more degradation, to feed the madness that consumed him. "It's not enough," he muttered, pacing before the window as rain lashed against the glass. "Evangeline, my darling, it's still not enough. I can still feel the sin clinging to my soul like tar." He turned to look at his victims, his eyes wild with religious fervor. Perhaps the ritual requires a more permanent sacrifice. Perhaps only death can truly cleanse the corruption from my spirit. Mercy, despite her pain, managed to lift her head slightly. Through swollen eyes, she saw Crow reaching for a knife from his collection of implements. The blade gleamed in the candlelight, and she knew with terrible certainty that he intended to use it. But as Crow raised the weapon, something extraordinary happened. The temperature in the room plummeted so suddenly that their breath became visible in the air. The candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing in patterns that defied the laws of physics, and in the sudden silence that followed, they could all hear it, the sound of drums beating in a rhythm that seemed to come from the very earth itself. "What?" Crow began, but his words were cut off as every candle in the room suddenly blazed higher, their flames turning from yellow to an eerie blue-white. The shadows on the walls began to move independently of their sources, writhing and twisting into shapes that resembled human figures. In the slave quarters, Etta's ritual had reached its crescendo. The carved figure in the center of her circle now glowed with an inner light, and the air around her shimmered with otherworldly energy. Ruth watched in amazement as the temperature dropped and the very fabric of reality seemed to bend around her friend. "Ancestors of my blood," Etta chanted, her voice carrying power that seemed to come from generations of the oppressed. "Spirits of those who died in chains, hear my call. Your children cry out for justice. Your children demand retribution." The response was immediate and overwhelming, the cabin filled with presences that Ruth could feel but not see, dozens of spirits answering Etta's call. The air became thick with their anger, their pain, and their thirst for vengeance against those who had tormented them in life. "Show yourselves," Etta commanded, raising her arms toward the ceiling. "Let the oppressor see the faces of those he has wronged." Back in the manor, Crow stumbled backward as the shadows on the walls began to take definite shape. Faces emerged from the darkness, the faces of slaves who had died on his plantation and others like it. Men, women, and children who had perished from overwork, disease, violence, and despair. Their eyes burned with an otherworldly fire, and their mouths opened in silent screams of accusation. "No," Crow whispered, the knife falling from his trembling hand. "This isn't real. This is just the laudanum, just my guilt manifesting as hallucinations." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. The spirits were real, and they had come for him. One figure stepped forward from the mass of shadows, a tall woman with tribal scars on her face and eyes that held the wisdom of ages. She wore the tattered remains of the dress she had died in, and around her neck hung the broken chains that had bound her in life. "Nathaniel Crow," she spoke, her voice echoing from beyond the grave. "You who have taken pleasure in the suffering of my children. You who have perverted the sacred into the profane. Your time of reckoning has come." Crow fell to his knees, his mind finally snapping under the weight of supernatural terror. "Evangeline!" he screamed toward the portrait of his dead wife. "Help me! Save me from these demons!" But when he looked at the portrait, he saw that it had changed. Evangeline's painted face now wore an expression of disgust and horror, and her eyes seemed to look directly at him with condemnation rather than love. "Even she turns from you now," the spirit woman continued. Even your beloved wife cannot bear to look upon what you have become." The other spirits began to move closer, their forms becoming more solid with each passing moment. Crow could see the wounds that had killed them, whip marks, rope burns, the hollow cheeks of starvation. They reached out with hands that had once picked his cotton, hands that had built his wealth through their suffering. In the chaos, Dinah and Mercy found the strength to crawl toward the door. The spirits paid them no attention. Their focus was entirely on the man who had tormented them in life and continued to torment their descendants in death. "Please," Crow begged, his voice breaking. "I was trying to purify myself. I was trying to cleanse my soul for Evangeline. Everything I did was for love." The spirit woman's laugh was like the sound of wind through a graveyard. "Love? You call this love? You have defiled the very concept with your actions." She gestured to the implements of torture scattered around the room. "These are not the tools of purification. These are the instruments of a monster who has lost all claim to humanity." As the spirits closed in around him, Crow's sanity finally shattered completely. He began to laugh, a high, hysterical sound that mixed with the thunder outside to create a symphony of madness. "Yes!" he screamed. "Yes, I am a monster, I am damned. But if I am to burn in hell, then I will take as many with me as I can." He lunged for the knife he had dropped, but his hand passed through it as if it were made of smoke. The spirits had begun to affect the physical world around him, bending reality to their will. "Your time of causing harm is over," the spirit woman declared. "But your time of suffering has only just begun." The other spirits began to chant in languages that predated the arrival of Europeans in Africa, their voices joining together in a harmony that spoke of justice delayed but not denied. The very walls of the manor began to shake, and cracks appeared in the foundation as the accumulated weight of centuries of oppression finally found its voice. Outside, the storm reached its peak, with lightning striking the ground around the plantation with supernatural frequency. The field hands huddled in their cabins, sensing that something momentous was happening, but not daring to venture out into the night. In her cabin, Etta felt the power flowing through her reach its climax. The carved figure in her circle now blazed with light so bright that it hurt to look at directly, and she could feel the presence of her ancestors as clearly as if they were standing beside her. "It is done," she whispered, her voice hoarse from chanting. "Justice will be served." But even as she spoke, she knew that the night's events were far from over. The spirits had been awakened, and their hunger for vengeance would not be easily satisfied. The plantation that had thrived on human suffering was about to become the stage for a reckoning that would echo through the ages. In the manor, Crow's screams joined the howling of the wind as the spirits began their work. The man who had thought himself master of life and death was about to learn that some powers are beyond human control, and some crimes demand a punishment that transcends the boundaries between the living and the dead. The supernatural storm that had engulfed Crow Manor intensified as the spirits of the dead claimed their dominion over the plantation. Inside the study, reality itself seemed to bend and warp around Nathaniel Crow as the accumulated rage of generations of the oppressed finally found its target. Crow cowered in the corner of his study, his mind fractured beyond repair as the spirits circled him like predators. The tall woman who had first spoken continued to lead the supernatural tribunal, her presence growing stronger with each passing moment. "You sought purification through the suffering of others," she intoned, her voice carrying the weight of countless graves. "Now you shall learn what true suffering means." The spirits began to show him visions, not of his own memories, but of theirs. Crow was forced to experience every moment of agony he had inflicted, but from the perspective of his victims. He felt the terror of Etta and Ruth during their first night of torment, the despair of Dinah as her innocence was brutally stolen, the helpless rage of Mercy as she was degraded beyond human dignity. But the visions didn't stop there. The spirits showed him the suffering of every slave who had ever lived and died on his plantation. He experienced the agony of families torn apart at auction blocks, the desperation of mothers watching their children sold away, the slow death of hope in the hearts of those who had once been free. "Stop!" Crow screamed, clutching his head as the visions overwhelmed him. "I understand. I repent. Please just make it stop." Repentance. The spirit woman's laugh was like the sound of chains breaking. "You speak of repentance while the blood of innocence still stains your hands. There can be no forgiveness for what you have done." Meanwhile, Dinah and Mercy had managed to crawl from the study and were making their way through the manor's corridors. Their bodies were broken, but their spirits remained undefeated. As they moved through the house, they could see the supernatural chaos unfolding around them. Portraits weeping blood, furniture moving of its own accord, and shadows that reached out with grasping fingers. "We have to get to the others," Mercy whispered, supporting Dinah as they stumbled toward the servants' entrance. "We have to warn them." But as they reached the main hallway, they encountered something that made them both freeze in terror. Evangeline Crow stood at the foot of the grand staircase, her form translucent but unmistakably real. She wore the white dress she had been buried in, now stained with grave dirt and decay. "I'm sorry," Evangeline said, her voice carrying the hollow echo of the tomb. "I'm so sorry for what he's done. I never wanted this. I never asked for this." Mercy found her voice first. "Then help us stop him." Evangeline's ghostly form flickered as if she were struggling to maintain her presence in the physical world. "I've been trying to reach him, to make him understand that his actions were driving him further from salvation, not closer to it. But the madness has consumed him completely. The spirits in the study," Dinah managed to say through her pain. "They're going to kill him." "No," Evangeline replied sadly. "Death would be too merciful. They have something far worse planned for him." In the slave quarters, Etta felt the ritual reaching its conclusion. The carved figure had stopped glowing, but the presence of the spirits remained strong around her. Ruth helped her to her feet, both women exhausted from the supernatural exertion. "Is it over?" Ruth asked. Etta shook her head. "The spirits have answered our call, but their work is just beginning. Crow will face justice, but—" She paused, looking toward the manor where strange lights flickered in the windows. "But I fear the cost may be higher than we anticipated." As if summoned by her words, the door to their cabin burst open. But instead of Whitmore or another overseer, it was Dinah and Mercy, supported by the ghostly form of Evangeline Crow herself. "Dear God," Ruth breathed, staring at the apparition. "The spirits you called," Evangeline said, addressing Etta directly. They're not just seeking justice for recent crimes. They're calling forth every injustice, every cruelty, every death that has occurred on this land. The plantation itself is becoming a conduit for their rage. Etta felt a chill of understanding. The ritual, it was more powerful than I thought. I called on my ancestors, but they've awakened others as well. Outside, the supernatural storm was affecting the entire plantation. In the fields, the cotton plants began to wither and die, their white bolls turning black, as if burned from within. The slave quarters shook with otherworldly tremors, and several of the field hands reported seeing figures walking among the rows, figures of people who had died years or even decades ago. Back in the manor, Crow's torment had taken on a new dimension. The spirits were no longer content to simply show him visions of suffering. They had begun to inflict physical pain, making him experience every lash of the whip, every moment of starvation, every indignity that had been visited upon their people. But worse than the physical agony was the psychological torture. The spirits forced him to confront the truth about himself, that his claims of seeking purification were nothing more than elaborate justifications for his own sadistic nature. They showed him that even before his wife's death, he had taken pleasure in the suffering of others, that Evangeline's passing had simply given him an excuse to indulge his darkest impulses. "You were never seeking redemption," the spirit woman declared, as Crow writhed on the floor. "You were seeking permission to become the monster you always were." The revelation shattered what remained of Crow's sanity. He began to laugh again, but this time it was the laughter of a man who had finally accepted his own damnation. "Yes," he cried. "Yes, I am a monster. I have always been a monster, and I regret nothing." His admission seemed to satisfy something in the spirits. The tall woman nodded slowly, as if a judgment had been reached. "Then you shall remain a monster," she said. "But not in this world, not where you can harm the innocent." The spirits began to chant again, but this time their words carried a different power. The very fabric of reality around Crow began to tear, revealing glimpses of something beyond, a place of eternal torment where the screams of the damned echoed through endless darkness. "No," Crow whispered, finally understanding what they intended. "No, please, death, yes, punishment, yes, but not that place. You showed no mercy to those under your power," the spirit woman replied. "Why should you expect mercy now?" As the portal to damnation widened, Crow made one last desperate attempt to escape. He lunged toward the window, perhaps hoping to throw himself to a quick death rather than face eternal torment. But the spirits were ready for him. Ghostly hands seized him, holding him fast as the darkness beyond began to pull at his soul. In the slave quarters, the 5 women, 4 living and 1 dead, watched in horrified fascination as supernatural light blazed from the manor's windows. They could hear Crow's screams even over the howling wind, and they knew that justice was finally being served. But Etta also sensed something else, a growing instability in the spiritual forces she had unleashed. The boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead had been torn open, and it was not closing as it should. "We need to end this," she said urgently. "The spirits have had their justice, but if the portal remains open much longer, it could affect the entire region." Evangeline's ghostly form nodded in agreement. "The ritual must be completed properly, or the consequences could be catastrophic." As Crow's screams reached a crescendo and the supernatural storm threatened to tear the very plantation apart, the women prepared for one final confrontation with forces beyond human comprehension. The night was far from over, and the true test of their courage was yet to come. The supernatural maelstrom surrounding Crow Manor had grown beyond anything Etta had anticipated when she first called upon her ancestors for justice. The very air crackled with otherworldly energy, and the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead had become dangerously thin. In the study, Nathaniel Crowe hung suspended between two realities, his physical body still in the manor, but his soul being inexorably drawn toward the portal of damnation that the spirits had opened. His screams had taken on an inhuman quality, echoing not just through the house, but across dimensions. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking as spectral hands dragged him toward the swirling darkness. "I'll free them all. I'll give up the plantation. I'll dedicate my life to—" "Your life is over," the tall spirit woman interrupted. "Your promises are worthless. You had countless opportunities to choose compassion over cruelty, mercy over malice. You chose evil at every turn. But even as justice was being served, Etta could feel the ritual spiraling out of control. The portal that was meant to claim only Crowe was beginning to affect the entire plantation. In the slave quarters, several of the older buildings had begun to collapse as the supernatural forces destabilized the very ground beneath them. "The spirits are too angry," Etta said, her voice tight with concern as she watched the manor through the cabin window. "They've been waiting too long for justice. Their rage is consuming everything." Evangeline's ghostly form flickered with distress. "If the portal continues to grow, it won't just take my husband. It could pull in anyone with guilt or sin on their souls. And in a place like this," the implication was clear, "on a plantation built on human suffering, few souls were entirely clean. The field hands, the house servants, even some of the overseers who had shown occasional kindness, all could be at risk if the supernatural forces weren't contained." Ruth looked toward the manor, where the windows now blazed with an otherworldly light that hurt to look at directly. "What can we do? How do we stop something like this?" "The ritual needs to be completed properly," Etta said, reaching for her grandmother's artifacts. "But it requires a sacrifice. Someone has to enter the manor and close the portal from the inside." "I'll go," Mercy said immediately, despite her injuries from Crowe's torture. "It's my fault this got so out of hand. If I hadn't—" "No," Evangeline interrupted, her voice carrying surprising authority for a ghost. "This is my responsibility. Nathaniel is my husband, and his madness began with grief over my death. I should be the one to end it." Dinah, who had been silent since their escape from the study, finally spoke up. "What about us? What about all the people who are still suffering here? Even if we stop this tonight, tomorrow there will still be slavery, still be masters who think they own other human beings." It was a question that cut to the heart of their situation. Even if they succeeded in stopping Crowe and closing the portal, the fundamental injustice of their circumstances would remain unchanged. Etta considered this as she gathered her ritual implements. "One battle at a time, child. Tonight we stop a monster and save innocent lives. Tomorrow we figure out how to change the world." Meanwhile, in the manor, the supernatural chaos had reached a crescendo. Furniture flew through the air as if caught in a hurricane, portraits bled real blood, and the very walls seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Crowe's body was being stretched between dimensions, his form becoming translucent as the portal claimed more of his essence. But the spirits weren't content with just taking him. Centuries of accumulated rage had been unleashed, and they wanted to punish everyone who had ever participated in the system of oppression. Ghostly figures began to materialize throughout the house, not just the spirits Etta had called, but others who had been drawn by the supernatural disturbance. Some were slaves who had died on the plantation, but others were different. These were the spirits of overseers, slave catchers, and even other masters who had met violent ends. The portal was calling to all souls marked by the sins of slavery, regardless of which side they had been on. "This is getting out of hand," Evangeline said, her ghostly form becoming more solid as the supernatural energies strengthened her presence. "I have to get to the study and try to reason with them." "You can't go alone," Etta said firmly. "The spirits are beyond reason now. They need to see that justice can be served without destroying everything." The 5 women, 4 living and 1 dead, made their way through the storm toward the manor. The journey that should have taken minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they fought against supernatural winds and dodged debris that flew through the air with deadly force. As they approached the house, they could see that the damage was even worse than they had imagined. The entire structure was beginning to collapse in on itself, as if the weight of accumulated sin was finally proving too much for the physical world to bear. "The servants' entrance," Mercy shouted over the howling wind. "It's the only way that might still be passable." They fought their way to the back of the house, where the door hung open, banging against the frame with each gust of supernatural wind. Inside, the corridors were a maze of floating debris and swirling shadows. The very air seemed thick with the presence of the dead. "Stay together," Etta commanded, clutching her grandmother's carved figure tightly. "And whatever you see, whatever you hear, don't let go of each other." As they made their way through the house, they encountered spirits at every turn. Some were benevolent, slaves who had died on the plantation and who nodded respectfully to Etta as she passed. But others were malevolent, their forms twisted by rage and hatred into something barely recognizable as human. One spirit, a former overseer who had been killed by rebellious slaves on a neighboring plantation, blocked their path with eyes that burned like coals. "You think you can control this?" he snarled at Etta. "You think your little ritual can contain the rage of centuries?" "I think justice doesn't require the destruction of the innocent," Etta replied, standing her ground despite her fear. "And I think you have no business here. This is not your fight." The spirit laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Every fight is my fight now. The portal calls to all of us who are marked by this place, this system. We are all damned together." But before he could attack, Evangeline stepped forward, her ghostly form blazing with sudden light. "No," she said firmly, "this ends here. I will not allow my husband's madness to destroy more lives." The confrontation between the two spirits sent shockwaves through the house, causing more of the structure to collapse. But it also cleared a path to the study, where the portal continued to grow, and Crow's screams echoed across dimensions. "Go!" Evangeline told the others. "I'll hold them back as long as I can, but you need to close that portal before it's too late." As the women rushed toward the study, they could hear the sounds of supernatural battle behind them. Evangeline was fighting not just the malevolent spirit, but dozens of others who had been drawn by the portal's call. She was buying them time with her very existence, knowing that the effort might destroy what remained of her soul. The study door stood open before them, revealing a scene from the depths of hell itself. Crow hung suspended in the center of the room, his body stretched between realities as the portal pulled at his essence. Around him, the spirits of the plantation's dead continued their judgment, their forms now so solid they seemed more real than the physical world. "We're here," Etta announced, stepping into the room with her companions. "We've come to finish what we started." The tall spirit woman turned to look at them, her ancient eyes reflecting both approval and sadness. "You have done well, daughter of Africa, but the price of justice may be higher than you anticipated." As if to emphasize her words, another section of the manor collapsed, and they could all feel the portal's pull growing stronger. Whatever they were going to do, they had to do it quickly, before the supernatural forces consumed not just Crow, but everyone and everything around him. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the fate of everyone on the plantation hung in the balance. The study had become the epicenter of a supernatural storm that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of reality. Nathaniel Crow's form flickered between dimensions as the portal to damnation pulled at his soul, while around him the spirits of the dead continued their relentless judgment. Etta stepped forward, her grandmother's carved figure glowing with ancestral power. "Honored spirits," she called out, her voice carrying across the chaos. "Your justice has been served. Nathaniel Crow will face eternal punishment for his crimes. But if this portal remains open, innocent lives will be lost." The tall spirit woman turned to face her, and for a moment the supernatural winds calmed slightly. "You speak of innocence, child, but look around you. This entire plantation was built on suffering. How many truly innocent souls remain?" It was a question that cut to the heart of the moral complexity surrounding them. Even among the slaves, there were those who had been forced to participate in the oppression of others, house servants who had informed on field hands, drivers who had wielded the whip to protect their own families. The system of slavery had corrupted everyone it touched, creating a web of complicity that was impossible to untangle. "Innocence isn't about perfection," Mercy said, stepping forward despite her injuries. "It's about choice. Most of us never had a choice in what we became. We did what we had to do to survive." Dinah nodded, finding her voice despite her trauma. "And the children, the babies who haven't even been born yet, they don't deserve to pay for the sins of their parents." Ruth joined them, forming a line of solidarity before the supernatural tribunal. "We're not asking you to forgive the unforgivable. We're asking you to remember that justice without mercy becomes vengeance, and vengeance without limits becomes evil itself." The spirits murmured among themselves in languages that predated written history. Some seemed swayed by the women's arguments, while others remained consumed by their rage. The portal continued to pulse with malevolent energy, and Crow's screams echoed across dimensions. But it was Evangeline's arrival that finally tipped the balance. The ghostly woman materialized in the center of the room, her form bearing the wounds of her battle with the malevolent spirits in the corridors. She was fading, her essence nearly depleted from the effort of protecting the others. "Please," she said, addressing the spirit tribunal directly, "I know I have no right to ask for mercy. I lived in comfort while others suffered. I enjoyed the fruits of their labor while remaining willfully blind to their pain. But I'm asking not for myself, or even for my husband. I'm asking for those who had no choice in any of this." The tall spirit woman studied Evangeline with ancient eyes. "You speak truly, daughter of the oppressor, but words alone cannot undo centuries of injustice." "No," Evangeline agreed, "but actions can begin to balance the scales." She turned to face the portal where her husband's soul was being drawn into damnation. Nathaniel chose his path. He chose cruelty over compassion, evil over good. Let him face the consequences of those choices, but let the portal close with him. Let his damnation be the end of this cycle of vengeance. The spirit woman considered this for a long moment. Around them, the supernatural storm began to calm slightly, as if the very forces of nature were waiting for her decision. "There is wisdom in your words," she finally said. "But closing the portal requires a sacrifice. Someone must remain behind to seal it from the other side." "I'll do it," Evangeline said immediately. "It's my responsibility." "No," Etta interrupted. "This started with my ritual. I should be the one to finish it." But the spirit woman shook her head. "Neither of you can make this sacrifice. The portal can only be sealed by one who has been touched by both worlds, the living and the dead, but who still has a choice about which realm to inhabit." Her gaze fell on Dinah, and everyone in the room understood. The young woman had been so brutally traumatized that she stood on the threshold between life and death, her spirit partially detached from her physical form. "No," Mercy said firmly. "She's just a child. There has to be another way." But Dinah stepped forward, her young face showing a maturity that had been forced upon her by unimaginable suffering. "I understand," she said quietly, "and I choose to do this." "Dinah, no," Ruth pleaded. "You have your whole life ahead of you. You can heal from this. You can find happiness again." The young woman smiled sadly. "Can I? After what he did to me, after what I've seen tonight, I don't think I'll ever truly be alive again anyway. At least this way, my death will have meaning." Etta felt tears streaming down her face. "Child, there are other ways to find meaning, other ways to heal." "Maybe," Dinah agreed, "but this is my choice. For the first time in my life, this is truly my choice. She walked toward the portal where Crow's form was being pulled into the swirling darkness. As she approached, the supernatural energies began to respond to her presence, the chaotic winds calming into a more controlled spiral. "Wait," the tall spirit woman said, raising her hand. "There may be another way." She gestured to the other spirits gathered in the room. "We have lingered too long in this world, bound by our anger and thirst for vengeance. Perhaps it is time for us to move on, to find the peace that has been denied to us for so long." The other spirits began to nod in understanding. One by one, they stepped forward, their forms becoming more translucent as they prepared to release their hold on the physical world. "We will seal the portal from within," the spirit woman declared. "Our combined essence will be enough to close the rift and ensure that Nathaniel Crow faces his judgment alone." "But what about justice?" Etta asked. "What about making sure this never happens again?" The spirit woman smiled, and for the first time, her expression held warmth rather than anger. "Justice is not just about punishment, child. It is about ensuring that the innocent are protected and that the guilty face consequences for their actions. Tonight, both have been accomplished." She turned to address all the women in the room. "You have shown courage in the face of unimaginable horror. You have stood together when the world tried to tear you apart. That unity, that strength, that is how you change the world. Not through vengeance, but through solidarity." The spirits began to move toward the portal, their forms growing brighter as they prepared for their final journey. But before they departed, the tall spirit woman had one last message for Etta. "Your grandmother's power flows through you, child. Use it wisely. Use it to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Use it to build rather than destroy." As the spirits entered the portal, their combined energy began to stabilize the rift. The chaotic supernatural storm that had threatened to consume the entire plantation gradually subsided, replaced by a sense of profound peace. Crow's screams cut off abruptly as he was pulled through the portal, his form disappearing into the darkness beyond. For a moment, his face appeared one last time at the edge of the rift, his eyes wide with terror as he realized the full extent of his fate. "Evangeline!" he cried out desperately. "Save me, please!" But his wife turned away, unable to watch his final moments. "You made your choices, Nathaniel. Now you must live with the consequences." The portal began to contract, the edges of the rift pulling inward as the spirit's sacrifice took effect. The supernatural light that had blazed from the manor's windows gradually dimmed, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the plantation began to lift. As the last of the spirits disappeared into the portal, the rift sealed itself with a sound like thunder. The study fell silent except for the gentle patter of rain against the windows. Normal rain now, not the supernatural storm that had raged throughout the night. Evangeline's form began to fade as well, her purpose finally fulfilled. "Thank you," she said to the four women who had survived the night's horrors. "Thank you for showing me what true courage looks like." "Wait," Dinah called out. "What happens now? What happens to us?" Evangeline's smile was peaceful as she prepared to depart for whatever realm awaited her. "Now you live, you heal, you find ways to help others heal, and you remember that even in the darkest times, there is always hope for justice." With those words, she faded away, leaving the four women alone in the destroyed study. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over the plantation, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful after the horrors of the night. Etta gathered her grandmother's artifacts, wrapping them carefully in their cloth. "We need to leave," she said quietly. "When the authorities come to investigate what happened here, we can't be found." "Where will we go?" Ruth asked. "North," Mercy replied, her voice stronger than it had been all night. "There are people who help runaways, safe houses. We'll find a way." Dinah nodded, her young face set with determination. Together. We go together. As they made their way out of the manor, they could see that the supernatural events had left their mark on the entire plantation. Several buildings had collapsed, the cotton fields were withered and black, and an unnatural silence hung over everything. But they also saw signs of hope. Other slaves were emerging from their quarters, looking around in wonder at the changed landscape. Word was already spreading that Master Crow was gone, that something had happened during the night that had freed them all from his tyranny. "What do we tell them?" Ruth asked. Etta considered this as they walked toward the road that would take them away from the plantation forever. "We tell them the truth, that sometimes, when human justice fails, other forces step in to balance the scales. And that no matter how dark things seem, there is always hope for freedom." As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the devastated plantation, the four women began their journey toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Behind them, Crow Manor stood empty and broken, a monument to the consequences of unchecked evil. But ahead of them lay the possibility of a new life, built on the foundation of their shared courage and the knowledge that they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. The plantation that had been built on human suffering had finally fallen, and in its place something new could grow. The spirits of the dead had found their peace, justice had been served, and the living had been given a chance to heal. It was not a perfect ending. The institution of slavery still existed, and there would be many more battles to fight. But it was a beginning, and sometimes a beginning is all that hope requires. Epilogue. Years later, when the four women had found new lives in the North, they would sometimes gather to remember that terrible night in Alabama. They would speak of the courage they had found in each other, of the power of standing together against impossible odds, and of the spirits who had answered their call for justice. Etta became a healer and midwife, using her grandmother's knowledge to help other escaped slaves build new lives. Ruth learned to read and write, eventually becoming a teacher who educated the children of former slaves. Mercy found work as a seamstress, her quick fingers creating beautiful garments that brought joy to those who wore them. And Dinah, despite the trauma she had endured, grew into a strong woman who dedicated her life to helping other survivors of violence. She never forgot the night when she'd been willing to sacrifice herself for others, and she carried that courage with her always. The plantation itself was eventually abandoned, its fields returning to wilderness as nature reclaimed what had been stolen from it. Local people said it was haunted, and perhaps it was, but not by malevolent spirits. Instead, it was watched over by the peaceful souls of those who had found justice at last. And on quiet nights, when the moon was full and the wind was still, travelers passing by the ruins of Crow Manor would sometimes hear the sound of singing, the voices of the free, celebrating their liberation and reminding the world that no evil, no matter how powerful, can stand forever against the combined strength of those who refuse to surrender their humanity. The story of that night became legend among the communities of escaped slaves, passed down through generations as a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, will always find a way to prevail. And in that way, the spirits of the dead continued to protect the living, ensuring that their sacrifice would never be forgotten and that their legacy would inspire others to stand up against oppression wherever it might be found.